The class started out when I realized that most people know very little about our Constitution and, national history. In fact, I will wager that most of your listeners don't even know the first president of the United States.
Who was the first president of the United States?
Well, most people would guess that it was George Washington because that's what we've always been taught in school.
Mm-hmm.
However, the United States began in 1776 when we signed the Declaration of Independence. George Washington became president in 1789, 13 years later. What people fail to remember is that for the first 9 years or so, we had the Articles of Confederation. And under the Articles, we had a new chief executive every year. The first president of the United States was Samuel Huntington. The first president of the United States under the Constitution was George Washington. So your information is not completely wrong, but it's also not completely right. And the World News and World Report did an article on this last August that had George Washington's photo on the cover, and it discussed this very possibility, and they correctly identified Samuel Huntington as the actual first president of the United States.
Really? That's amazing. I want to ask you one more thing. You had an encounter during the 2004 presidential election where you too got to test your own constitutional rights, and that was the ability as a candidate to be able to speak before a live audience, to be a part of the debate. Can you share exactly a little bit about what happened that day that some people may not be familiar with?
Well, in October, George Bush and John Kerry were holding their second presidential debate in St. Louis, Missouri. David Cobb, the Green Party presidential candidate, and I basically joined forces. We gave a little speech, and we crossed the police line. We were immediately arrested, handcuffed, and put into a police van. Now, you have two gentlemen in jackets and ties handcuffed in the back of a police van, and 20 minutes later, a police officer opened the back door and said, "Which one of you guys is a presidential candidate?" And my answer was, "We are both presidential candidates. We are at a presidential debate, and you have us in handcuffs." I said, "Can you explain that to me?" And the police officer looked very perplexed and said, "Let me get back to you on that." So the only place that this information was published was on my website and on David Cobb's website. My website had over 1 million hits that afternoon because they eventually took us off to jail. They released us at midnight. But for 4 hours, my campaign manager and the rest of the world had no idea what my actual location was. And they were doing 15-minute updates on my blog. And finally, at 12:01, just after midnight, they released us. But the building had no, cell phone, not a cell phone, public phone, and there was no address on the building. So when I called my campaign manager and he said, "Where are you?" I couldn't give him an answer. I mean, they had to call the police department and say, "If you were going to arrest a presidential candidate and take him to jail, where would you be likely to take him?" And so they were able to find me about 1 o'clock in the morning.
Wow. Michael, I think if there is a time for people that don't know what their basic Bill of Rights are, this is, there couldn't be a better time now with all the things that are happening in the geopolitical structure, people talking about things like, oh, I don't know, a central government with merging constitutions like they are experiencing in England with the European Union's expansion. I think this is probably more important than most people realize.
I taught my class, my 8-hour class, to a group of college students in Houston. They subsequently dragged me to a coffee house and asked me questions for 5 more hours. I finally had to beg to just be, I had to go and get some sleep because I was exhausted after 14 continuous hours talking to college students who usually don't stay awake that long without beer and pizza.
I got a short attention span, I can understand, but it's probably very empowering for you to see young people interested in an issue like this.
Well, I love to talk to college students. My first question is, how many people plan to live at home with mom and dad 5 years from now? Nobody raises their hand. I said, well, why would you move from a wonderful household into a small studio apartment and live at the poverty level on purpose? And the answer is liberty. You want to make your own decisions. And my final question is, if you won't allow mom and dad to make decisions for you, then why would you allow the government to make decisions for you? I mean, does the government love you more than mom and dad? And I think the answer to that is pretty obvious.